July 20th, 1960. Off Florida, the United States fires a Polaris missile from a submerged submarine. That single act rewrites the Cold War. Within months, the USS George Washington can park off Norway and hold Moscow, Leningrad, the entire Soviet heartland, under 16 thermonuclear warheads. For the Soviet Union, the fragile balance of mutually assured destruction had just been broken. This was a strategic death sentence. Their own nuclear subs had to completely surface to fire, rising helplessly off the American coast as sitting ducks. Cornered, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave a fatal order.
No more excuses. Put it to sea, now!
It was meant to be the ultimate weapon to paralyze the US Navy, but instead, it became a floating doomsday machine. This is the story of a submarine so cursed its own crew called it Hiroshima before it ever left port, a boat built to incinerate American cities that instead burned its own crew from the inside. The Polaris A-1 missile was a revolution. Solid-fueled, compact. It could be launched from a submerged submarine at ranges of up to 1,200 nautical miles. A single boat could carry 16 of them. The Soviet Union's first purpose-built ballistic missile submarine, the Golf class, was diesel-electric, noisy, and had to surface to launch its 3 R-11FM missiles, a procedure that took over an hour and left the boat completely vulnerable. The irony was excruciating. On September 16, 1955, the Soviet submarine B-67, a modified Zulu-class boat, had successfully launched an R-11FM missile, the world's first submarine-launched ballistic missile. The Kremlin had beaten the Americans by 5 years, but that missile was a modified Scud, liquid-fueled, finicky, and with a range of barely 150 kilometers. To threaten Washington, a submarine would have to surface off the Virginia coast, sit motionless for an hour of fueling, and then fire a missile that might simply explode in its tube. The United States had watched that clumsy debut and quietly built Polaris, a system that made the Soviet achievement obsolete. Khrushchev didn't just fear the missile gap. He was enraged that his own admirals had handed the Americans a victory and called it progress. Khrushchev understood that the nuclear balance was shifting underwater. His admirals warned him that the United States planned to build 41 Polaris submarines. If they succeeded, the Soviet Union would be surrounded by hundreds of submerged missile tubes, any one of which could start a war. The response had to be immediate, overwhelming, and terrifying. The Soviet Navy had been working on a nuclear-powered submarine since the mid-1950s. The first, K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, had been launched in 1957. But Khrushchev wanted more than a torpedo boat. He wanted a strategic platform that could threaten the American homeland. In 1956, the Kremlin had authorized Project 658, a nuclear-powered submarine designed from the keel up to carry ballistic missiles. NATO would later call it the Hotel class. By the time Polaris flew, K-19 was already on the ways, but the shock of that launch would transform a construction project into a desperate, breakneck race. The lead boat of this new class was designated K-19. Her mission deployed to the Atlantic, close within missile range of the US East Coast, and hold American cities hostage. She was to be the Soviet Union's first true sea-based nuclear deterrent, and she was built in a frantic, terrifying rush. The Soviet Union's submarine construction program was a pressure cooker. The United States had already launched the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, in 1954. The Soviets had rushed their own nuclear boat, K-3, into the water in 1957. Now, they had to leap ahead again from attack submarine to strategic missile platform in barely 2 years. K-19 was laid down on October 17, 1958, at the Severodvinsk shipyard on the White Sea. The build schedule was brutal. Engineers worked around the clock. Welding inspections were cursory at best. Later, a joke circulated among the workers that the boat was being assembled with a sledgehammer and a prayer. Before K-19 ever touched the water, 2 explosions during construction killed at least 8 workers. The boat was taking lives before it had even earned its name. During the launching ceremony, tradition demanded a woman swing a bottle of Soviet champagne against the bow and shatter it. The ritual was meant to bring good luck. Instead, a male officer, Captain 3rd Rank Panov, performed the swing. The bottle struck the hull and bounced off, entirely intact. 2 violations in a single moment. For the superstitious, it was a terrible omen.
My God!
The crew, already wary of the new boat's untested reactor design, began calling her Hiroshima before she ever left port. Captain Nikolai Zateyev, a 35-year-old officer with a reputation for competence and loyalty, was given command. Zateyev entered the Naval Academy during the war and later commanded diesel-electric submarines before transitioning to nuclear boats. He was serious, disciplined, and fully aware that his new command was a political project as much as a naval one. If K-19 succeeded, the Soviet Union would have a credible sea-based deterrent. If it failed, Zateyev didn't let himself think about that. K-19 was 114 meters long, displaced over 4,000 tons, and sailed on her first combat patrol with 139 men aboard. Her twin VM reactors could push her to 26 knots. Her 3 R-13 missiles, SSN-4 Sark Tornado, each carried a 1 megaton warhead. But to fire them, K-19 had to surface, raise them on a hydraulic elevator, and sit motionless for 12 minutes. The American Polaris could launch from underwater in minutes. K-19 would not gain that submerged launch capability until a refit years later. On her maiden patrol, the Soviet system was dangerously primitive. The fatal vulnerability, however, was not the missile. It was the reactor. The VMA had a single primary coolant loop, no backup, no emergency core cooling. If that loop failed, the core would overheat within minutes. Loss of coolant accident. Even after scram, decay heat about 7% of full power continues to build. Without coolant, fuel cladding oxidizes at 1,200 degrees Celsius, producing hydrogen. By 2,800 degrees Celsius, the fuel melts. If the pressure vessel ruptures, a steam explosion can breach the hull and release radioactive fission products into the sea. If the hull was breached and the boat sank, the 3 warheads lying just forward in the missile compartment could be crushed against the sea floor, scattering plutonium across the Atlantic. Even without a nuclear detonation, K-19 carried the ingredients for an international disaster. It was a doomsday machine in both directions. It could incinerate an American city. Or it could melt down, explode, and take its crew and its missiles to the bottom of the ocean, and it would leave a plume of radioactive contamination spreading across the Atlantic. June 18, 1961. K-19 slipped out of Zapotnaya Litsa and headed for the North Atlantic. Her orders: reach a launch area within missile range of the United States, simulate a nuclear strike, then survive Exercise Polar Circle, a war game where Soviet hunter-killers would try to hunt her down. For the first time, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was deploying within striking distance of the American coast. The timing was explosive. The Berlin crisis was escalating. The Bay of Pigs had failed in April. Both superpowers were on a hair trigger, and now a submarine carrying live nuclear missiles was creeping through the Atlantic. American intelligence knew something was out there. P-2 Neptune patrol planes crisscrossed the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. Destroyers swept the sea. Aboard K-19, the crew settled into the grueling routine. Reactor compartment temperatures soared past 50 degrees Celsius. Fresh water was rationed. The air thickened with a metallic taste of ozone. Zateyev knew the mission was political theater, as much as military necessity. The Soviet Union needed to prove it could project nuclear power under the sea. K-19 was the proof. On the 14th day, sonar picked up the beat of a destroyer's screws, possibly American. Zateyev ordered silent running.
Silence.
For hours, K-19 drifted, her reactor throttled to a whisper. The ping of active sonar echoed through the hull like a hammer on a coffin lid. Then it faded. If she had been forced to the surface, a Soviet missile submarine caught in America's backyard, the Cold War might have turned hot right there. But the greater enemy was already inside the hull, building pressure in a tiny pipe no thicker than a pencil. July 4th, 1961, 4:15 a.m. The North Atlantic, 200 miles southeast of Greenland. K-19 has been submerged for 16 days. Then, without warning, a capillary tube in the primary coolant loop snaps. A microscopic crack seeded by a careless weld during construction finally gives way. Coolant drains from the only loop. The core temperature starts to climb.
Captain, coolant pressure is dropping fast. Temperature is passing 600 degrees and still rising.
Shoot it down. Scram the reactor immediately.
The scram stops the chain reaction, but decay heat is unstoppable. Without coolant, the fuel rods will melt. If the pressure vessel ruptures, a steam explosion can breach the hull. Zateyev faces an impossible equation. The boat is 200 miles from land. A storm has torn off the long-range radio antenna. No Moscow. No rescue. They are buried alive in a steel tube, and the only sound is the rising scream of temperature alarms. And inside that tube, a second crisis is taking shape. A faction of officers led by the political officer, Captain Lieutenant Ivan Guby, are demanding Zateyev's surface and surrender.
Comrade Captain, we must surface. Hashed for John Mayen. It is our only chance to survive.
They want to beach the submarine on Jan Mayen Island, a NATO-controlled outpost. Hand the Soviet Union's newest nuclear missile platform to the enemy. Zateyev understands the calculus instantly. If K-19 is captured intact, every Soviet naval nuclear secret goes with it. He cannot let that happen. He makes a quiet, definitive decision. The decision was martial law.
I am ordering martial law.
Every firearm aboard, every rifle, every pistol went into the Atlantic. Zateyev kept 5 Makarovs, one for himself, one for Executive Officer Arkhipov, and one each for the 3 other men he trusted with his life. He calls for volunteers to weld an emergency cooling line directly onto the shattered pipe inside the reactor compartment, where temperatures have hit 800 degrees Celsius and gamma radiation is lethal in minutes. They will wear only rubber suits and gas masks. They will absorb fatal doses before they finish.
I need volunteers.
8 men step forward. They are led by Lieutenant Boris Korchalov, 27 years old, the reactor compartment commander. The others are Petty Officer Yuri Ordochkin, Petty Officer Evgeny Kashenkov, Seaman Semyon Penkov, Seaman Nikolai Savkin, Seaman Valery Karatanov, Captain Lieutenant Yuri Povstiev, and Chief Petty Officer Boris Ryzikov. Not one of them hesitates. Vasily Arkhipov, the executive officer, does not enter the reactor. He stands at Zateyev's side, organizes the teams, rotates the dying men, and absorbs a crippling dose of radiation. Down here, he learns a lesson he will carry to another submarine 16 months later when he refuses to authorize a nuclear launch and prevents World War III.
I'll go first. If I don't come out, someone else takes the torch.
The moment he steps inside, the invisible assault begins. Gamma radiation ionizes the air, the sharp electrical stench of ozone. A choking taste of lead fills his mouth. His rubber suits, designed for chemical fallout, not a naked reactor core, begin to melt to his skin in the 800-degree heat. They work in shifts of 2 or 3 minutes, the maximum time a human body can withstand that environment. The radiation dose rate inside the compartment is estimated at 50 to 60 sieverts per hour. A whole body dose of 4 sieverts is lethal to half of those exposed. These men are absorbing thousands of times that. They rig the cooling system. The core stabilizes. The submarine is saved. But for the 8 men who went in, there is no recovery. And even as the temperature drops, a new disaster unfolds. In the chaos, a ventilation valve is opened. Radioactive steam floods through the ducts, the torpedo room, the sleeping quarters, the bridge. Every breath taken by all 139 men now draws radioactive isotopes directly into their lungs. Within hours, acute radiation sickness spreads through the boat. Nausea, vomiting, severe headaches. White blood cell counts crash to 0. Skin peels away. Internal bleeding begins. Over the next 3 weeks, all 8 volunteers die. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov, Captain Lieutenant Yuri Povstiev, Chief Petty Officer Boris Ryzikov, Petty Officer Yuri Ordochkin, Petty Officer Evgeny Kashenkov, Seaman Valery Karatanov, Seaman Semyon Penkov, Seaman Nikolai Savkin. Not one of them survives the month. The dead are buried in secret, in lead-lined coffins laid into the ground at night. 14 more crewmen, poisoned by the ventilated air, die in the years that follow. The Soviet Navy tells the families nothing, only that their sons died in service to the motherland. The truth will remain hidden for nearly 3 decades. K-19 limps home under tow. Her reactor is a radioactive wreck. Her crew is shattered, and at first the Soviet Navy blames the captain. The Board of Inquiry finds negligence, failure of leadership, failure of maintenance, failure of Zateyev. The reactor's fatal design flaw, the skipped safety checks, the single-loop coolant system, none of it is mentioned. But then the chief designer, academician Alexandrov, takes the stand and blames the crew for incorrect operation. It is a lie to protect his own reputation. Zateyev has kept a piece of evidence. He produces the shattered capillary tube, the tiny pipe that failed because a careless weld during construction. The fracture is undeniable. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the father of the Soviet nuclear navy, examines the fracture and delivers his verdict. It is not the crew that is at fault. The equipment is to blame. Zateyev and his men are exonerated. Zateyev is promoted. He retires as a captain first rank. But the real punishment is the gag order. The dead are erased. Their sacrifice is classified. For nearly 30 years, the Soviet Navy denies any accident ever happened. Zateyev is left to carry the names of his dead in silence. K-19 herself does not die. She is repaired, her reactor flushed and rebuilt. She returns to sea older, more infamous, still carrying nuclear missiles. And in 1969, she will make headlines for a very different reason. November 15, 1969. K-19 is on patrol in the Barents Sea, operating near American naval forces. She is no longer the pride of the fleet, but she still carries nuclear missiles, and she is still a target. USS Gato, a Thresher, Permit-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, is tracking her from below faster, quieter, far more maneuverable. Both boats are blind to each other's exact position in the noisy water. K-19 is maneuvering at 200 feet. Then, with a violent shudder, her bow drives directly into the Gato's sail. Her sonar dome is crushed. Her torpedo tube doors are jammed. The American boat's pressure hull holds. K-19 performs an emergency blow and surfaces. No one is killed, but the boat is badly wounded. The incident is quietly buried by both navies, standard practice in the underwater Cold War. The irony is brutal. K-19, the submarine that survived its own reactor trying to kill it, was nearly ended by a conventional collision. Two navies, chasing each other for over a decade. On that morning in the Barents Sea, they finally touched. K-19 had survived its own reactor, which claimed 22 lives and a collision with the US Navy. 2 years later, it would face a third disaster, one that killed more men than the reactor ever did. February 24, 1972. K-19 is running submerged in the North Atlantic when a hydraulic line fractures in the aft machinery compartment. Pressurized oil mists into the air, finds a hot surface, and ignites. Within seconds, the compartment is an inferno. Thick, toxic smoke floods the passageways. Men are trapped behind closed hatches. The fire spreads fast, too fast for the damage control parties to contain. By the time K-19 surfaces and the fires are extinguished, 28 sailors are dead. Dozens more are injured. The boat limps home once again, older, heavier, and more haunted than ever. 10 years later, in 1982, a fire in the battery compartment would claim 2 more lives. K-19 had become a submarine that consumed its own crew. Poisoned by radiation, crushed by an American submarine, gutted by fire. K-19 remained in active service for another 18 years. K-19 was repaired after every disaster, after the reactor, after the collision, after the fires. Each time, she returned to sea. Each time, her crew had one name for her: Hiroshima. Soviet sailors avoided assignment to her if they could. Those who served aboard her wore the stigma like a scar. By the time she was decommissioned in 1990, K-19 had become a grim joke among the fleet, a floating testament to rushed engineering, institutional cover-up, and the men who paid the price. But Captain Zateyev was not yet done fighting. Nikolai Zateyev spent decades fighting to have his crew recognized. He wrote hundreds of letters. He gave interviews to anyone who would listen. He defied a government that wanted the story to stay buried. Slowly, the truth began to surface. In 1988, under Gorbachev's glasnost policy, a Soviet newspaper published the first public account of the K-19 reactor disaster. The world learned what had happened 200 miles off Greenland. The families of the dead finally knew how their sons had died. Zateyev was vindicated, but the weight of those 8 men never left him. In interviews, he would often pause, stare at the ceiling, and say their names aloud, as if committing them to memory all over again. In February 2006, former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev nominated the entire crew of K-19 for the Nobel Peace Prize. The citation honored the sacrifice of July 4, 1961, the leadership that held the boat together, the 8 men who walked into the reactor compartment to save their shipmates, and the refusal to let the Cold War end in nuclear catastrophe. Nikolai Zateyev did not live to see it. He died on August 28, 1998, at 72, still carrying the weight of his crew's silence. He was buried with full military honors. At his funeral, the surviving men of K-19 stood together and saluted not for the submarine, but for the man who had led them through hell and spent his life fighting for their names. The crew did not win the prize, but for men erased from history, the nomination itself was a form of justice. Their captain, and the men who died under his command, had finally been recognized by the world. They were engineers, technicians, and sailors. They died not by an enemy torpedo, but by a reactor their own government had rushed into service. In 2002, the Russian government awarded the crew the Order of Courage. A memorial was erected at Kuzminskoye Cemetery. The dead were no longer erased. The truth, buried for 30 years, was finally allowed to stand in granite. Boris Korchalov, Yuri Povstiev, Boris Ryzakov, Yuri Ordoshkin, Evgeny Kashenkov, Valery Karitanov, Semyon Penkov, Nikolai Savkin. They saved their crew with a welding torch and a hose. They knew the radiation would kill them. They went anyway. They were dead within 3 weeks. The Cold War was fought with fear, with secrecy, with machines of unimaginable power. But on one of its darkest days, it did not end in nuclear catastrophe, because 8 men decided it wouldn't.